start this project, you need 36 4x4 inch squares. I have 12 green, 12 yellow, and 12 purple. I started off by cutting 4-inch strips and then subcutting them into 4-inch squares. You'll need several pieces of sashing. I cut this sashing at 1 3/4 inches wide, and then I folded it in half the long way and I pressed it with a nice crease. This is for the back of your quilt. For the front sashing pieces, you need to cut 1 1/8. That 1/8 of an inch is important, so make sure you get 1 1/8 inch. For the backing, this is just a piece of dyed fabric that's very much like tie-dye. I'm going to cut it into 4-inch strips and then subcut it into 4-inch squares, which I will need 36 of. Two strips, 4 strips. Okay, so instead of stack cutting the batting, I've cut 4-inch strips that are folded. And I'm going to put the fold to one side over here, and on the other side I'm going to start cutting. And this way, when they're lined up like this, I can get more done at the same time. I like to lay out all my background pieces first with the right side down so that I can kind of see what the back of the quilt will look like. Then I decide how I want the top to look. Now I'm using white thread on the bobbin and on the top, and I'm just going to go ahead and use a regular foot. I'm not going to do any free motion quilting. I am going to set my machine at a longer stitch a little bit. And I'm just going to come to the corners, needle down, pivot, and I'm going to make these bubble letters. They don't have to be exact, they just have to be recognizable. I'm going to have to jump over to the middle. Once you trim it, you've got an already quilted mini block. You could do these with 5-inch charm blocks. You could do them with 6-inch or 8-inch blocks. It does, if you want a really big quilt, make 10-inch blocks. But just remember, it's going to be 6 by 6. The blocks will be. This is going to be small. I might put borders on it at the end. But there's my A, and that's the back. And that's the front. And it doesn't matter with an A, but with other letters it will matter. So just make sure that you're always stitching from the front as you go, and go through all the letters. So at some point you'll get brave, and you'll decide you don't want to bother writing on the fabric anymore, and you're going to free motion it. So I'm going to free motion quilt. And I'm just going to go at a really slow speed. And it's good to start small. You know, if you're going to practice free motion, start with something that's not huge. And here's my letter D. And then I do a couple stitches in place to lock it, and then I continue on. It's good to try to keep your stitches uniform in length. But what better thing to practice with than a really tiny block of alphabet letters that we're so familiar with? And, you know, no one's going to think badly of you if they're a little off kilter. It's a kid's quilt. So there's my letter D, and I free motioned. So I have my A square, and now I want to attach it to my B square. And in order to do that, I'm going to put sashing in between. I start off with my wider sashing. This is the one that was 1 3/4 inches that I folded in half and pressed. Now I take these raw edges and I match them up with the raw edges of the block underneath the block. And I'm not matching up this top edge because it's a salvage right here. I'm going to cut that off. So that goes there, and then I take this other sashing piece. Now this is the sashing that was 1 1/8 inches wide, and it was not folded or anything, so it has 2 raw edges. And I put it right sides together with the block on the top. So I've made a sandwich, so you can see my sandwich. It's going to get a 1/4 inch seam here, right along this raw edge. Alright, so you can see that I've stitched the 1/4 inch seam. Let me just chop off this extra. You can pre-cut it to the size of the square, but I just like to use a long strip and chop it off as I go. So I'm going to press it open. I'm going to get my B square. I'm going to put them right sides together. And I'm going to match up this raw edge of the sashing with the raw edge of the B square. And I'm going to give it a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm not going to catch the block or this folded binding. I'm just going to do a 1/4 inch seam to hold the front sashing to the front of the B square. Okay, so I just sewed that seam to attach the flat sashing to the B square on the front, and there's my A and B. They're attached. When you flip it over to the back, you can see that when you flip it out nice and flat, all that batting meets up perfectly and leaves no gap. It's very nice. And then this sashing that has the fold in it gets pressed down over the seam that you just made, and it gets blind stitched to the back. But I don't sit and blind stitch them one at a time. I wait till I get a whole row together. So the next step is to get this edge ready for the next block. So to do that, you take your wider sashing that you folded in half and pressed, and you put it in the back, and you match up the corners, and you match up the raw edge all the way along, and then you take the flat sashing that hasn't been folded and you put it right sides together on the front, and you match up the raw edges. So you have 3 pieces. You have the front sashing, you have your quilt block in the middle, and then you have your back sashing. And all the raw edges are meeting, and again, you give it a 1/4 inch seam, and you snip off the excess. So I just added it with a 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to snip off this extra, even with the bottom of the block. So the front is hanging loose, the back is hanging loose, and that's where the C block will go, attached to the B. Okay, so I did that seam right along there. When I open it up, I have sashing in between my ABC. On the back, I have these loose pieces that will end up flipping over and getting blind stitched in place. Let me finish a full row first, and then I'll show you how to blind stitch. Now I know I've shown you how to blind stitch before, but I'm going to show you really quickly again. I've got this bright red or pinkish color thread on my needle so you can see what I'm doing. I have it's a single strand, there's a knot at the end. I'm going to place the needle into the fold of the sashing so that the knot gets hid inside. I'm going to fold the sashing up so that it meets the stitching line. And I'm going to come out of the sashing, and I'm going to go into the back piece of the quilt block and maybe a little bit of the batting as well. Now I look at where I came out of the backing material, and I go directly across from it into the fold of the sashing, and I take a good size stitch. Well, it was a little bit of a diagonal there. We're trying to not do a diagonal. We're trying to keep them straight on. And then I came out of the sashing at the fold there, so I go directly across from it into the back of the quilt block, and then directly across from it into the fold, and then directly across from it into the back. So I have this, it's also called the ladder stitch, so I have this ladder of stitches, and when I pull it tight, they magically disappear. That's blind stitching. So I'm going to go ahead and finish blind stitching all these pieces, and then I'll show you how to put the rows together. So I've put together a bunch of my blocks. The backs have these sashing pieces that need to be stitched down before you put the rows together. I have 2 rows that I've already stitched, blind stitched the backs of. So now I'm going to put them together. It's very important when you're putting them together to make sure that your sashing in between your blocks lines up nicely. The front sashing is the one that's not folded, so I take a length of sashing and I put it on the front of the row. And the back sashing is the one that is folded, and I take that and it goes on the back. So it's just like we did the blocks separately. You've got the folded sashing on the back, and you've got the flat sashing on the front. And you're making yourself a sandwich. So you put this on the entire row, and then you put the 2 rows together. So I've stitched an entire length of sashing to the bottom edge of my first row, and now it's going to get placed with the second row. And normally you would just open up your sashing, flip your row so that you can attach the front sashing to the second row. And be good with that, but I want to make sure that my sashing in between my blocks matches each other. So while I'm doing this, I'm paying close attention to where my sashing is on one block, on one row, and where it is on the other row. And I'm putting a couple of pins in just to make sure that they line up close enough that when you open up the sashing, you've got a nice congruent row there in a straight line. So if you just pin along and you don't pay attention, sometimes it gets off a little bit, and then it doesn't look so good to the eye. Like if I just went along and pinned this next one and didn't pay any attention, you can see that it's off. It's not a straight row. So you've got to pay close attention. This sashing can stretch a bit. The blocks might be a little bit odd shaped. I lay my sashing down so that it matches the other row's sashing before I put my pin in. and then I open it to check and make sure that it's straight and lined up. So there's my first 2 rows put together. And on the back, it's the same deal. You have to fold over that sashing and blind stitch it in between the rows. So I'll get the rest of this done and I'll show you how to put on a border. So I've made some border pieces. I have 2 short borders that are the actual size of the edge of the quilt. I'm going to attach those first, and then I'm going to attach the 2 longer borders on opposite sides. It's just the same way you do a square. You're going to sandwich your top border with your batting and your bottom border. I pieced some, I put some piping in there, I did some decorative stitching. I've got it so it's already quilted. That's going to go right on there. So I put it right sides together, and I'm just going to attach the top border piece to my actual quilt, and then I'm going to flip it back over, and I'm going to turn under this part on the back border, and I'm going to slip stitch it. So let me attach that and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so I've put my border on, and you can see that it looks just like a continuation of the sashing that was between the blocks, even though that was part of the actual border with the piping and the purple. And on the back, I don't have a separate piece of sashing. Instead, I'm just going to take that back border piece and I'm going to fold it under by 1/4 inch, and I'm going to blind stitch it just like I did the sashing pieces on the back. And that way I didn't have to attach a separate piece. So that gets blind stitched. Both of the opposite borders get put on, and then the top and bottom get put on the same way. On the back of the quilt, you can see that when I flipped this border over, I hadn't trimmed any of the batting back, and that's because I wanted to make sure that there'd be enough to fill that gap between the actual quilt body and the border of the quilt. And if you look closely, you can see that the seam from the border and the edge of the quilt meet exactly in the middle. So that means that I can trim my batting right to the edge of that seam, and then it'll match perfectly when I go ahead and turn it back flat and do the blind stitching on the back. So I'm just going to trim that away before I do my blind stitching. Attach the binding. You don't start at the very end of the binding, you start quite a ways in. You leave yourself a big tail there so that when it comes time to reattach it at the very end to itself, you have plenty of working space. I just put a couple pins in. When you get to the corner, it's folded up at the bias so you can see a nice miter, and then it's folded down again, so that it can continue on the other side. And you end up stitching along here, not including the fold, and then you stitch off at an angle, and then you start again right at that 1/4 inch, and then you go back down the other seam. When I'm getting to a corner, I'm going to stitch off at the diagonal. So I stop a 1/4 inch in from the end. I lift my foot, turn, and stitch off. Then when I round the corner, I'm going to flip up my binding so that it's at a nice miter and that it's square to the side. And then I flip it back down again, matching my raw edges with the edge of the quilt. And I'm going to put my needle in. This is my diagonal. You can feel it with your finger after you've sewn it and folded it. So I'm going to put my needle in just 1/4 inch from the side, right where that fold is. And that's how I'm going to start down the other side. When you're getting close to the end, it's good to stop and leave yourself some room to to manipulate the binding a bit. So here I am, I don't know, about 8 inches away from the end. And I'm just going to stop it there. And now I'll show you how to do this final seam to attach the binding to itself. So we're going to attach the binding to itself with a diagonal seam like we attached it all together before we started. And to do that, I open up the binding, open up that fold on both sides, and then I create my diagonal. So I'm going to do it by folding it up to itself and making sure that I'm square. And I'm using a gingham print here so it's easy to see. I'm following the line, and I'm making sure that's a good, perfectly mitered 45-degree angle. So I put a pin in it. So there's my one side. Now the other side I'm going to fold up as well. Actually, I'm going to fold it down because I want it to match exactly where it's going to be meeting as a seam. And to do that, it's kind of tricky. You have to fiddle with it a little bit. I've got this stretched out all the way here. So I know that this is my starting point for where I'm going to make it match. I'm going to put that pin in through the quilt so it doesn't move. So this side's the same thing. I'm going to pull it tight all the way across here. And then I'm going to fold it down so that it meets that seam and that it's nice and square to the side of the binding. So now if I were to stitch those two together exactly like that, it should be the perfect length it needs to be in order to finish it off without any puckers in the binding. So to do that, I want to match it up where it's going to meet at the end of the seam. And I like to put just a pin in right along the seam. So I'm going to take this one too, and I'm going to match it up there. And I take my pin, and I go into the fold, and then I go into the other fold, and then back out of that fold, and back into the first one. And it gives me my starting point so that when I open these up, and I lay them flat, it's just like it was when I was putting it together and it wasn't attached to the quilt. One's going this way and one's going this way. And now that I've finger pressed it, I have a nice diagonal seam to follow. And so I'll put another pin in to hold it in place. And the reason why I left myself all this room on the bottom of the quilt is so that I can scrunch the quilt up and I can lay this flat in my machine. And I can sew that diagonal seam. So there's the diagonal seam. Now I'm going to trim off this extra from both of the binding pieces. I don't need those anymore. Trim off my points. And now when I fold it back, first I'm going to open up my seam. I'm just going to finger press it open. And then I'm going to fold it in half like the rest of the binding is. And now I'm going to sew it to the edge of the quilt, and that should be the perfect width. So there it is, sewn to the quilt. Now the only thing left to do is to flip it all over to the back side, and once again we're blind stitching. I want to show you a corner. So here's the corner, and this is how you turn it. You just turn it over. It'll fall into a miter kind of nicely by itself, and then when you get to the other side, one side lays flat, and then the other side gets folded flat as well, and you end up with another nice miter that you can stitch in there. If you don't want to blind stitch this binding all the way around your quilt, you can do it by machine, but you have to be very careful. You can see the stitching line where you attached the binding to the quilt body. If you fold your binding up so that it just meets that stitching line exactly, and you stitch 1/8 of an inch close to that fold with your machine all the way around, and if you've lined it up perfectly, the other side will also have 1/8 of an inch stitching all the way around. But remember, that's the front, and you want it to look good, so you have to be very careful about lining up that fold right on the stitching line.